The next few years is going to see an increased activity on the lunar surface. Should we worry about heritage sites like that of the Apollo 11? What should be considered a World Heritage? In this episode of Chai on the Moon, we have a conversation with co-founder and president of the non-profit For All Moonkind, Professor Michelle Hanlon. Hello and welcome to another episode of Chai on the Moon, where we talk about societal and ethical issues related to human settlements in space and in particular on the moon. Our guest today is Professor Michelle Hanlon. She is the executive director of the Center for Air and Space Law at the University of Mississippi School of Law, a professor of practice within the University of Mississippi's Air and Space Law program. She's the editor in chief of the Journal of Space Law, which is the world's oldest law journal dedicated to the legal problems arising out of human activities in outer space. And we're going to talk about human activities in outer space, in particular on the moon. And I can go on and on about her other aspects as well, but in particular, she's also a co-founder and president of For All Moonkind, which is a non-profit, which I love the name, which is a non-profit corporation which is the only organization in the world focused on obtaining international legal recognition for the protection of human cultural heritage in outer space. And it has been, For All Moonkind has been recognized by the United Nations as a permanent observer to the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. And she contributes regularly to international discourse on space law through this particular committee. And in fact, she's just coming back from it. I'm going to talk to her about it in 1 second. But welcome, Professor Hanlon.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
So, just because I know that we were doing email exchanges and you were in Europe, and I just found out you just came back from the meeting. What happened? So, this is the COPIUS, so Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. Can you just tell us a little bit about what happened and sort of like what was the meeting about?
Sure, of course. So the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space has 3 meetings every year. In February, they have the Science and Technical Committee meeting, subcommittee. In May, this where I just came from is the Legal Subcommittee. And then they have the plenary, the full committee in June. For All Mankind attends all of these meetings, and we're permitted as observers to give very short interventions and also prepare technical presentations. These committees are really important. What's really fantastic about them is that the UN COPUOS has met every year since 1959. So
Oh,
even through Cold Wars, even through Russia invasion of Ukraine, all of this, these states still get into the same room and have these conversations. When it was first formed back in 1958, it had about 30 state delegates. Now it has more than 100. And so it's an excellent opportunity. Every time we think about, oh, we're never going to have another treaty for space, or this is all going, nowhere. And I always get tremendous hope because of the people in that room, because of the states that are represented in that room. The United States, China, Russia are always there. Iran, Cuba. Um, most of the European nations. So it's a real opportunity, and a lot, a very growing amount of African nations and Middle Eastern nations as well. So this is a really diverse group. Now, we're still looking, who are the big players? Russia, China, the United States, and so they still have the most amount of influence. But everybody has the opportunity to get heard, and we have what they call the general exchange of views, and that's really an opportunity for countries either to sort of brag on what they've done. So Turkey talks about the astronauts that they sent, or things that they're particularly concerned about. So For All Mankind, of course, goes and we talk about protecting heritage, and we talk about how important it is, not just because we want to protect history, but because it can be a foundation for peace for the future. And we have had we've been going since 2018. And in that time, we have had a lot of support, quiet support. Yeah, we think that's a great idea, but we're not going to support you,
right.
publicly. Yeah, of course we need to protect heritage, but we're not going to talk about that publicly. Um, Now is not, heritage is important, but now is not the time. We have other things to worry about, orbital debris. For the first time, we have this. The committee has formed something called the Action Team on Lunar Activity Consultation. And this is a recognition that humanity is going back to the moon. It's really exciting. And the UN is realizing, okay, well, at the very least, if we're not going to get some sort of framework on governance, at the very least, we need to share information. And so this task force action team is uh, uh, supposed to support that information sharing and other topics. And so for the first time, we had Poland, an actual state delegate, say in a conference room paper, "Hey, we need to consider cultural heritage when we consider information sharing and humanity's return to the moon." And so this is a tremendous, humongous, huge, whatever step for
I
cultural
like
heritage.
humongous. I like the word humongous. I think that actually combines it too. It's like hangry, so it's like humongous, like
Yeah.
So that means that Poland is sponsoring this this whatever, however we would say that, or is it something like that Poland is undertaking that others may or may not join? So how does that work?
Exactly. It's baby steps, right?
Yeah.
And so just to have now this will be uh, Poland will input it into the negotiation about what we call it the ATLAC, not AFLAC, ATLAC. Um, but so the first thing that the UN usually works at a glacial pace, but these action teams are intended to sort of speed things up, and this is it's a recognition on behalf of the international community that we need to really address this. And so Poland is going to suggest that the ATLAC must consider cultural heritage, and then there will be negotiation about whether that happens or not. So at this point, we're doing what we can to support Poland. We are preparing. For All Mankind is preparing, a conference room paper explaining why it's so important. And I think the big thing is, and what uh, people sort of poo-poo, oh, heritage, who cares who's going back. The problem is there's two things. First, there's a problem because it's all up there. People are planning like satellites around the moon, and they don't have end of life. And the lunar orbit is not very stable, and so one of these satellites could fall on, Luna 2 or Apollo 11. But the second thing, and so much more important, is everybody on earth agrees that we need to protect cultural heritage, right? That's why we have the UNESCO World Heritage Convention. That's an agreement we can take to space with us as a foundation for future agreements. And so it's about protecting history, but even more so protecting our future.
That's great, and actually, that's a good segue. You had written a few years ago an article titled "Space Archaeology: Our Nubia Moment," and and I found it really intriguing. Can you describe a bit about what you were referring to? And I think some of the stuff that you just said, I think, would fit in directly into that. So, what is the Nubia moment?
I'm so delighted that you read that. Thank you. So the interesting thing, in parallel to the Apollo program in the 1950s and 60s, Egypt realized, well, the only way we're going to be able to develop our economy is if we can harness and tame the power of the Nile River, right? Because famously, the fortunes of the Egyptians really was like, well, is it going to flood? Is it going to be, we're going to have a drought? What are we going to do? And so if they could control that and have that steady stream and always know, then they would be able to have a better chance of developing their economy. So the idea was to put a dam on the Nile River to control it. Now, unfortunately, where they had planned on putting the dam means that the water would collect in the Nubia Valley. The Nubia Valley is considered one of the birthplaces of human civilization, and it has temples and beautiful monuments. And so Egypt thought, what can we do? And so they went to the international community and said, hey, we really need to do this in order to develop our economy. What should we do? We need your help. And you know what? Some of the international community, they didn't say, "Oh no, you can't develop. You're going to ruin the birthplace of civilization." And they also didn't say, "Oh, who cares?" Right? They said, "Okay, we understand we need to balance. We have a responsibility to balance our universal history. Like this is something that humanity can be proud of, with the need to develop." And so the international community came together and raised $80 million. And in the 1960s, they moved these humongo, another word, humendous temples out of the Nubia Valley up to dry land so that when the dam was built and the Nubia Valley was flooded, you would still have all these temples and monuments. Incredible achievement. The Kennedy White House was heavily involved. It was Jackie, one of Jackie O's pet projects, um, and this and it was that was the birth of the UNESCO World Heritage Convention. That's when we started understanding, look, these are all human achievements. Sure, it's in Egypt. Sure, it's in China, England, but these are a record of humanity, of the growth of our species, about how we've been able to evolve and start working together. And that was the birth of the UNESCO World Heritage Convention, and it was recognized then that protecting cultural heritage builds kinship. I think they
Hmm.
used the word brotherhood back then, but we say kinship now. Um, Builds kinship. We recognize that we should all be very proud of these achievements as humans because they're the culmination of all of human evolution and history. And that's what we take with us when we talk about protecting cultural heritage in outer space. This is our Nubia moment. This is a time for our generation to come together and recognize that we need to protect these. And guess what? Nubia, it costs $80 million. Right now, it's free. All we have to do is get a resolution through the United Nations that says there is cultural heritage in outer space and name two or three sites. We don't want, when you look at how cultural heritage is identified and recognized, and, I'm not an archaeologist. There's a lot of big words. Oh, well, this is and that shows and this is. No, but we can all agree. I've never met anybody, and I've talked to a lot of people around the world. I've not met one person who has said, no, we don't need to protect the Apollo 11 lunar landing site. Makes no sense. Everybody agrees. Humanity's first footsteps on another celestial body is equivalent to things that it's far more, what's the word? Inspiring than many of the things that we protect here on Earth. This is something because um, you realize the United States always says 400,000 people worked on the Apollo project, but that's really narrowing what exactly happened here, because we don't get to the moon without the entirety of human evolution, right? We don't
Right.
we don't get to the moon unless somebody, one of our common ancestors, stood up on 2 feet, freed their
Yeah.
hands to make tools and carry things. We don't get to the moon without learning how to communicate with each other. So the caves in Lascaux with the drawings, that was part of our journey to the moon. We don't get to the moon without math, which we think started to be developed in the Congo. We don't get to the moon without glass, which was developed first in Mesopotamia. So we don't get to the moon without the entirety of our human evolution, and that's why it's so important to protect those boot prints.
Yeah, no, that's great. So, and I want to have another question related to that, and that is, you mentioned within that Egyptian context that it was still within the country aspect, but space actually it makes it a little bit more difficult because, I mean, you are bringing sort of like the mission to the moon on a really humanistic context, and perhaps it's more necessity as well for the moon because I mean because of the ownership aspects that come in.
So we actually, the space is not this lawless wild wild west. We have an outer space treaty. It's only 17 articles, so barely 2 pages long, but it has two fundamental precepts. One is freedom of exploration and use, free access to all areas of all celestial bodies, and nations cannot claim territory in space
Yeah.
by means of use or occupation, by sovereignty, or by any other means. So you can't own anything in space. So the idea of protecting a heritage site fundamentally conflicts with the law. Um,
Uh,
so what are we going to do? Well, think about what we're trying to do on the moon. And the United States, President Obama signed a law that made a lot of countries really angry. We said, well, okay, this Article 2 is the principle that says you can't own the moon, essentially. And the bill that President Obama signed said, well, we interpret Article 2 to mean that you can extracting resources and using those resources however you want does not violate the law. This caused a stir throughout, of course, we had Russia imperialism. But it has aged well, that law. It has been followed also. Luxembourg, UAE, Japan have similar laws. India is preparing a law with a similar thing. And biggest breakthrough in terms of diplomacy, China wrote a conference room paper, submitted it to the United Nations, and also said, we believe you can use resources in situ. Um, and it's common sense because we can't take bricks and mortar to space. Well, we could, but imagine the cost of like sending
uh,
construction material to space. It's hard enough to get it on Earth nowadays. So it's common sense that you have to be able to use these. Now the question is, okay, you set up your mining operation, and we've agreed that you can extract the resources, own them, but we still have Article 1 and Article 2, which say, hey, free access. I get to come over and, get really close to your mining operation and see what you're up to. Maybe take some of the product that you haven't mined yet if I mine it faster. Um, so what are we going to do with that? That's not fair, right? That's not equitable. And so what we're doing at For All Moonkind is suggesting, look, the law actually gives us a path forward because we also have an article called the due regard provision. You have to conduct your activities in space with due regard for the activities of others. If you think you're going to harmfully interfere with somebody, you have to have a consultation. And Article 12, a conflict within the treaty, says if you have an installation, then you have to give access to others on a reciprocal basis. So it's built in this opportunity for consultation. And so we we believe if we can create, and I'm calling them managed access protocols, because you want to manage access. You're not keeping anybody out. You're not violating the outer space treaty. You're managing access to these really important historic sites. If we can get that, because we know that everybody agrees historic sites are important, that can be the framework for how we actually also protect commercial operations, scientific operations, other sites on the moon that will be increasingly important.
so these historical sites are going to get protected based upon the idea that those were sent. I mean, those are a product of that place. I mean, in some sense, that's. I mean, it's not in situ, but sort of like they were sent from outside, but now there is a region where yes, people can come in. I mean, there is this management access, but that this is of importance to that country or to the world. I mean, how is that distinction playing a role in there?
So it will be, it's important to the world. It's important to all
Mm,
humanity. We're borrowing from the UNESCO World Heritage Convention to recognize that cultural heritage is something we share universally. As I mentioned, what is more universal than these achievements that were built on the backs of the entirety of humanity? And it's not, I like the way you're thinking. Is this now some sort of resource that we're extracting? No, no, we're relying on the concept of due regard,
right.
and the concept that's an installation. So even though we haven't put up, a fort and doors and said this is our installation, the fact that it's sitting there kind of makes it an installation. It's not operational, but the key here is manage access, because look, I've never been to the moon. I don't know what happens. We have scientists who say, or the astronauts who were there, who said, "Wow, this lunar dust is just everywhere. I can't see through it. It's jetting everywhere. It's getting into my spacesuit." Harrison Schmitt couldn't breathe; he was having trouble. So we know that there are, if you get too close, if you drive your rover too fast, you're going to get this ejecta, this plume effect. But we don't know exactly what it does. There's NASA guidelines, voluntary guidelines, which say please don't get m- less than 2 kilometers away from the Apollo site. But those were made up. That there was no science behind that. So any kind of framework that we have has to be flexible. It has to be temporary. And when I say temporary, it doesn't
Mm.
mean, oh, we're only going to protect it for 10 years. It means, hey, we're going to keep going back and looking. How safe is it to approach? Who should approach? Because, we can protect them. Sure, nobody can get anywhere near close, but then what's the value in that? We need to be able to study
Right.
them and appreciate the history of them as well.
So I want to go in a similar direction, but talk a little bit about heritage, right? I mean, so we're using the word heritage, and I think there would be very little debate about something like Apollo 11, for example. And of course, there are other Apollo missions. We can talk sort of like think about whether how would we think about their importance and things like that. But of course, Luna 2, you mentioned sort of like there were other missions that have been there. Uh, so how do you define heritage, and in some sense, as time progresses, as all and also from the global perspective, who gets to define it in general?
I have no idea. So my job is to get the issue on the table, so that we start
Ah,
considering it. But I do have thoughts. So there are more than 115 sites on the moon with evidence of human activity. More than
yeah.
115, and we know we're going to start getting more and more and more. iSpace is due to land on June 5th, 2025. And so we can't, not everything can be heritage. This is a balance, right? I want to see the moon. I use the word develop, but I want to see, we need to use the moon because it's our proving ground. I don't think we're going to find rare earth metals that are the panacea and save all of humanity on the moon. I think we'll find them in the asteroids beyond. But in order to get to those asteroids, in order to get to Mars, we have to understand what it's like to live and work in space, and might as well do that on the satellite, our natural satellite that's closest to us. So, how are we going to decide what should be protected, what shouldn't? Well, when we go to the United Nations, we say, look, there's four that we think are shoo-ins. Luna 2, first human-made object to impact another celestial body. Uh, Apollo 11, first humans on the moon. Chang'e 4, or first mission to the far side of the moon, successful mission, and Chandrayaan 3, first successful mission to the lunar South Pole region. Um, Interesting that they're all from different countries, right?
Right.
Um, but those would be the starting point, and then we need a process. I can't presume to know what that process looks like. We have a lot of heritage law experts, and archaeologists and anthropologists who work at UNESCO and talk about what should be, or even domestically within the United States, we have historic preservation sites, and so it will be a nomination process, and there will be criteria. I can't pretend to know what those will be, but I do think one thing is very important is it has to be universal achievements, human
Yeah.
achievements. We cannot protect every boot print from every new nation that gets to the moon, right? And
Right.
I know that sounds harsh, and I know, and it's not to suggest that Mexico shouldn't have tremendous pride when it gets a rover on the moon, but there's a difference, and we do have technology now where we can record, but not necessarily protect and preserve, right? Um, what we want to do at From Unkind is make sure. So, these footsteps in Laetoli, Tanzania, which are the first evidence we have of standing upright, right? They were discovered in 1970. They're thought to be around 3 million years old. We don't really know. What we want to prevent is having to have 3 million years from now somebody on the moon going, huh, where do you think humanity first set foot on the moon?
Yeah.
we can save that now, and that's
Right.
that's part of the process.
Well, that's a really interesting comparison. I mean, again, with the Africa, again, and I think that would be, yeah, I mean, which footprints and how, with the importance of those things. I think that's actually an interesting point. But if I can look on the opposite side of that, and I know For All Moonkind, and you are also involved in setting policies on how to use the moon as well. I think you also participated in Lunar Policy Handbook. This I think came out a couple of years ago, which is with the Secure World Foundation. So I think they published that, and you were part of the team as well. And there are also concerns apart from protections of these sites. There are also concerns about what goes to the moon, and you, the For All Moonkind. I learned sort of like, you also have the ethical issues. So there's an institute of ethics as well now coming in, and I know a couple of years ago there was a crash on the moon that included tardigrades, for example, which was an issue because tardigrades have those microorganisms that are really hard to kill in some ways, and they can survive outer space. We know that, but there was a moon mission, there was a lunar mission, and a private company from Israel, I think, and
Hmm.
that included those tardigrades, but those were not disclosed in general. And so, if something is going in iSpace, you mentioned is going up soon. There have been a lot of other private missions going on. So, on the one hand, you have this issue of preservation of sites, but on the other, how do you regulate these kind of private missions or state missions, of what they carry, how do they decontaminate, and so on and so forth? How do you see that happening?
So I'm really glad you brought that up because we are still in this mentality of if you can get it to the moon, just do it. Let's just go to the moon because we can do it. This was highlighted when Chandrayaan 3, when India announced they were going to go to the South Pole of the moon. Russia was like, "Oh yeah, we can do that," and so they sent a mission a week before, pretty much with the knowledge that they were probably going to crash land, but they thought, well, we'll just try it anyway. You mentioned the tardigrades that had these private missions, these commercial missions, need funding, and so wealthy people are like, yeah, okay, I'll give you $1 million if you send my DNA. And then I'll slip in these tardigrades. And guess what? If you are launched from the United States, the only payload review is from the Federal Aviation Administration, and they don't care. They just care about safety. Are you going to explode when you get to the moon? Are you going to cause a liability on orbit? Are you going to make the taxpayer pay? And so nobody's really regulating. So last in 2024, Astrobotic had a mission to the moon, and on that, their part of their payload was from Celestis, which is an organization that will send your ashes to space, your cremains, they call them. And these were supposed to land on the moon. 130 cremains were supposed to land on the moon and lay there pristine for all eternity. Um, and there are already ashes on the moon. NASA in
Yeah.
the 1990s was like, "Hey, let's send some of Eugene Shoemaker's ashes to the moon. Cool, that'll be fun." Okay. And when the Navajo Nation heard about it, they objected back in the 90s. And there was because to them the moon is sacred. And if you have a sacred temple, you're not going to mar it and throw ashes on it, right? Think about your church. Or your temple, wherever, whatever you believe. And so uh, they complained to the United States government, and the U.S. government said, "Okay, Navajo Nation, we're sorry. Um, we promise that we will consult with you before we do it again." So important here is they didn't say we're not going to do it, but they said we'll consult. So then Astrobotic had these 130 cremains on them. Um, Nobody consulted with the Navajo Nation. And Navajo Nation complained to the US government again. And, this is where lawyers get a really bad rep because NASA was like, oh, that wasn't our payload. So, we didn't have an obligation to tell you. Well, come on. You
Right.
knew it was going. You should have had a consultation. And historically, it wasn't like it's not going to go, but maybe there's something in the Navajo tradition that would make it appease them or make it better. It became an issue about religious rights. Celestis said, "Well, you can't impose your religious rights on everybody else, Navajo Nation," but it's really not. It's about who is making those decisions, and you make a
Yeah.
really good point. Who is going to make that decision? I don't think ashes should go to the moon. iSpace is taking a little house built by some artist in Sweden. I
Mm.
don't think that should go to the moon. Why are we sending junk to the moon?
Yeah.
This is going to be a very vital place for the expansion of humanity into space. Forget these little houses and these moon arts and whatever. Let's focus on the science. But who is going to make that decision? Who's going to decide? Oh, that's frivolous and that's
Right.
science. I don't know, but I do know that we need more voices in that decision making process. And so one of the things, both as my role at For All Moonkind and as the executive director of the Center for Air and Space Law here at Ole Miss, is raising awareness. And which is why, thank you again for having me on this podcast because people have to know. People don't know that we're headed back to the moon. People don't know that we're sending ashes to the moon. People don't know that. And everybody, one thing we know about space is it's the province of all humankind. I don't know what that means legally, but it feels like everyone should have a say in what's going on, right? And so that's one of their biggest issues right now.
So I mean, I think, I mean, does it? I mean, I'm just curious. I mean, in some sense, right now, a lot of the private companies, they fall into this middle zone, and in some sense, they do and they don't, because they are registered in some country, some nation. So in the U.S., for example, the Federal Aviation Authority, they give them permission to go, so they have to get permission from them, and the responsibility of something bad happens falls onto the country that gave them permission.
Mhm.
But on the other hand, just like as you mentioned that NASA was supposed to consult with the Navajo, but when they didn't, they said, well, it was a private mission, right? And so even though it was taking NASA payload, so there is that loophole that comes in. And same way, a lot of these private companies fall into that category because they say, well, it's a private mission. And so it's somebody is paying us to take that. It's not the same thing as a state mission. So I'm wondering, are you involved in it, or For All Moonkind or other groups, in terms of regulating what goes on there? So in the same way, sort of like, through United Nations, where just I mean, the other outer space treaty aspect is, well, you cannot have weapons of mass destruction, or nuclear weapons on the moon, for example. Okay, well, that is something that, yeah, nobody can have those. Is this something that, okay, well, if you are going to leave something on the moon, uh, should it be sort of like, vetted to a certain degree, especially for biological things, right? I mean, because contamination, there is an issue of contamination, especially on Mars, but certainly, I mean, less so on the moon, but it is an issue. So do you see that as a vehicle from United Nations, or do you see another way of implementing it, or it is a little bit of a wild west?
So, Article 9, that due regard provision also says that you cannot harmfully contaminate another celestial body.
Right.
And the way that that has been interpreted has been through the Committee on Space Research, COSPAR. COSPAR has a whole set of planetary protection rules, and they are intended to prevent forward contamination. They don't want biologicals going out, and backward contamination. We don't want to bring, some huge deadly virus back to Earth. What's interesting about COSPAR is it was created also in the 50s, maybe even the 30s, and at a time when we felt really lonely in the universe. I think we still do, but I like to talk about the prime directive of Star Trek, which is if you see another species,
Yeah.
just leave it be. The Coast Bar is so much stricter than that because it's like, it's not if you see another live species, it's if you see any trace that at any point in the history of another celestial body there might have been evidence of something that was alive, don't contaminate it.
Right.
And so the moon is what we call a category 2. We're pretty confident there's no life. There has never been life on the moon. And so we don't care if you send biological material. Under the law, and you brought up the tardigrades, that was actually a violation of international law because under the law it says, or the Coast Bar interpretation says, if you're going to send biologicals, inform people and tell us what you're
Mm.
doing. It's not going to don't. It doesn't say don't. Now Mars is a category 5. Don't send biologicals. Decontaminate everything. Well, you can't decontaminate humans. So if we're going to send
Right.
humans to Mars, something's got to give there. But that's all we have in terms of international regulations of what you send. And we've seen the issue with respect to orbit, right? There's no law that makes you clean up
Right.
after yourself on orbit. And our orbit is getting crowded. As you mentioned, you can't put nuclear weapons or weapons of mass destruction. That's it. That's the only
Right.
deterrent. I mean, you can. The United States is the only country that has a law that says you can't put obtrusive advertising in space.
Right.
Um, but if you launch from, for example, New Zealand, as Rocket Lab launched, that sort of disco ball a few years ago, you can do that. And that's all sorts of ethical issues. What are you doing to the night sky? Why do I have to look? That yesterday it was a disco ball. Tomorrow it's the Coca-Cola logo.
Right.
I mean, where does it stop? And the same thing with the moon. Um, One of the payloads, I believe, on iSpace of either this mission or the next one is going to be a uh, sports drink, like a Japanese sports drink, like Gatorade, the Japanese equivalent of Gatorade. And they're going to put it in a titanium bottle and they're going to plant it on the moon and take pictures of it and say, oh, when humans get back, they'll have their Gatorade waiting. I, I don't, there's no law against that. And even if the United States were to make a law, right? If we were to say, okay, no, so we are not going to permit companies to launch human ashes to the moon, some other country's going to say, okay, but you can do it from here, and we lose a revenue stream and a way of developing because again, especially with these other astrobotic, iSpace, intuitive machines, Firefly, it's hard to be a startup that's going to the moon.
Yeah.
So if you can make money by selling, spots in your payload, by all means do it. But we have to figure out because otherwise, the moon is just going to turn into a junk heap. I mean, if it,
But that's why. So I mean, you were saying, what if the U.S. passes a regulation? But my guess would be, I mean, wouldn't that be something from the United Nations that can potentially, like outer space treaty? And I know that would be pretty hard to sort of like pass by everything, but something like this, like we should try to avoid making moon a junkyard, for example.
Yeah, and so I mean, you can understand why nations haven't done it yet, right?
Right.
The international community, because we don't, nobody wants to limit our capability to do things. And so, and then also, again, whose judgment call? China sent lettuce seeds. And iSpace is also sending a disc of a popular Japanese band, right? And what international body is going to decide that? Now, the way space law generally works, and we've had some success with orbital debris. Um, the space agencies around the world decided, okay, the debris is a problem. Let's have guidelines, and so guidelines were prepared by these space agencies. They were submitted to the United Nations, and the United Nations adopted them. They're voluntary. They're not binding, but nations have pretty much stuck to them, and they're not very strict. You have to make sure you deorbit your satellite within 25 years of the end of life. I mean, come on. Um, but that's how we get standards and norms. And so, yes, the international community, perhaps as part of this ATLAC, can say, okay, we should limit what lands on the moon to things that are scientifically useful. It may be. And then when you have a guideline like that produced by the international community, by the United Nations, then it says, please include that in your national laws.
Yeah.
And so at that point, then we would say, okay, and then it's not binding. So, are you going to include it? Are you not? One thing I will say, very proud of as an American, the United States has always been at the forefront of these kinds of measures for space. We've reduced, even though the international requirement is 25 years, we reduced ours to 5 years, right? And
Oh,
so
okay.
the United States has always been a leader in regulating space, even at the expense of its own licensees, and we must continue to do so.
That's pretty good. One other question regarding this again. So if we are talking about something that goes up, and whether it should go whether it sort of like adds to contamination over there or not. But there is another aspect, and I'm trained as an astronomer, so of course, like moon is an amazing place to do astronomy. Um, but here you have a case where if you have construction, for example, on the moon, if a base is being built, then it can create radio interference, which would and vibrations. For example, you can have satellites which are already there, a couple of them, but there more satellites are expected to be on the moon, which can both create light and, more importantly, radio contamination. And for radio waves, the far side of the moon is really amazing. Nothing equivalent exists, sort of like in the nearby solar system. So, how, or for all moonkind, or you, how do you think about balancing this need for development, as you mentioned, private and national programs, versus here you have astronomers who want to protect, I mean, or have this thing as a protected region from radio frequency, for example. So,
So this is
how do
something
you
that
balance that? Yeah.
that is actually being considered by the United Nations as part of that ATLAC, and then there's also a working group on space resource activities. Um, the I think it's the IAU, the International
Yes.
Astronomical Union, is intervenes and makes statements about we need to protect. There's an entire group that's just really focused on protecting the far side.
Yeah.
But there is, again, these groups. It's all coming from observers. No state delegates have taken this up yet, but saying, look, we should do science. There's some groups that say we should do science before we do commerce.
Right.
So put the brakes on the commerce, let the scientists go first to these places. I- You know, it, the way that the budget cuts are going, we'll never get the scientists there anyway. Um, but yeah, we do have to have this balance, and people are just starting to realize that. So that is one of the things when we talk about the ATLAC, that lunar activity consultation. The first step is information sharing. That's the biggest step, and I think that
Mm,
we're going to see at the plenary in June that we're going to focus on what does information sharing look like? What kind of information do we have to share? When do we have to share information? What does it mean once we've shared that information? So if the United States alerts the United Nations that it's going to the Shackleton crater in 2033, does that mean nobody else can go there?
mm,
That's and so as part of that consideration, um, we at For All Mankind and as a space lawyer, I'm advocating that we should also consider heritage sites. So I want all the countries with an interest in the moon, and it's not just the countries that have landed on the moon. For example, on Apollo 11, they left a couple Omega watches, right? Those are from Switzerland. Switzerland has an interest in protecting those
mm,
watches. The first lunar experiment was actually from the University of Bern, the lunar sail. So that's Swiss. So um, I think from if we are going to couch it all in terms of information sharing, share the information that what you have on the moon, and if you want some sort of protection or recognition, or you want to manage access to that, and then that I I believe we should start with heritage, because we can all agree that these sites, we have a lunar reconnaissance orbiter. There's something there.
mm.
You can't argue against that. That this is where the Apollo 11 lunar landing module is. we should also do that for scientific sites and sites of natural and scientific importance. But that's going to be a debate, right? Well, how important is that scientifically? Do we really need that? Do you really need the whole far side? So let's do the easy things first. We know these sites exist. Let's recognize that they should have different access protocols, and then let's talk about the science, and let's talk about the natural beauty of the moon, that desolate, the magnificent desolation.
Yeah.
Um, we want to protect that too. I
Right.
would like my children to see, my children's children to see what Buzz Aldrin saw.
Yeah.
Um, but again, balanced against development.
Yeah, and it's a tough one. And again, I mean, some people have argued sort of like the models to think about. I think national parks or Antarctica, for example. Antarctica comes up, even though that is not protected by the United Nations treaty, but Antarctic treaty works in a different way. But that you don't see any of that type of thing, sort of like moon being a research type of station. You don't see that as happening practically or ethically. I mean, do you see that?
And I don't see that happening. So,
Uh-huh.
and you're absolutely right. The Antarctic Treaty is really interesting, and people bring it up all the time. Have you thought about it? And I'm like, I've been a space
Right.
lawyer for a long time. I can
Mm.
guarantee I've thought about it. Um, Two things. You cannot mine in Antarctica.
Right.
Mining is banned.
Right.
And so, that's just it. That's not going to happen. I can guarantee that's not going to. The U.S. would never agree to that. China, and what does mining mean? I mean, in Antarctica, do all the scientists live in igloos? No,
Right.
you brought the resources there. We can't do that on the moon. We're gonna have to mine it to build the installations.
Right.
So there's just no parallel there. And also, don't forget, the Antarctic Treaty didn't solve all our problems. It just pushed the can down the road. Um, they agreed to not think about sovereignty and preserve all their claims over Antarctica. We can't do that on the moon. We have this concept of the province of all humankind, whatever that is, and we have to figure out uh, yeah, how we're going to interpret and work around that.
So if I can continue with this particular thing about what does humankind means. I mean, right? I mean, because I mean, I was trying to get to this sort of like the conflict of interest between research and commerce, for example. But you also have we talked about the remains, cremains, versus sort of like Navajo claims regarding that. But also, moon is sacred in many ways, and beyond sacred. I mean, not purely from the religious sense, but also from a cultural context. It's important to many people. Okay, so how do we define this province of all humankind? um, Even if you're thinking about, okay, so can you build a mega structure, big structure on the moon that can be visible? Now that can be allowed because you can actually do that. um, but then there are humans who think, well, moon is sacred, people should not go there, too, something should not be visible, and all of those things. So there is a whole range of opinions about the moon. How do you think we should go about debating those things? How should we think about again, who gets to decide other than might is right, or sort of like, okay, well, here are the five countries that can go to the moon, and when they are going to decide because they can do that, or private companies, even worse.
So it's the age-old question, right? Who owns the moon? And the
Right.
answer is everybody on Earth, right? It's the province of all humankind. That is, and when I say what does that mean, what's important is it does not mean it's the common heritage of humankind, which is how we look at the high seas. And that brings with it sort of these obligations to share benefits. And in the law, we go back to res nullius, it belongs to no one, therefore anyone can claim it. And res omnia, I'm just not pronouncing anything right today, which means it's owned by everybody, and so you have a shared responsibility to it, right? Province of all humankind falls short of that concept. And the
Hmm.
United States has said, it was a Trump executive order back in 2020, that the United States does not consider space to be a global commons. and will never do so. And in fact, no U.S. president has ever considered space to be a global commons. So, how are we going to? One of the I am so privileged to be able to go to the United Nations COPUOS and contribute to those discussions, even though observers aren't allowed to do a lot. We are able to watch, and we are able to continue to advocate for our what we want. But it is really kind of sad that this room has about 300 people in it, representing 100 different countries, and they're making decisions that are going to impact all of humanity.
Right.
Some people don't, a lot of people don't even know what COPUOS is, right?
Yeah.
And so we really need to get the word out. We need to get people, look, we live in a representative democracy. You can call your congressperson and complain about orbital debris. You can call your congressperson and say, I don't think we ought to be sending ashes to the moon. Or you can call your congressperson and say, hey, I don't think we ought to have any restrictions on the moon. I want to see a 15-story hotel on the moon. We need voices from everywhere, from every community, participating in that conversation. Even if you never want to go to space, even if you're just like, I don't care about space, who cares? I've got so many problems on Earth, and I don't want to go to the moon. Everything we do in space is going to affect every single person on Earth. You have to recognize that. And whether it's a direct impact from a remote sensing satellite, a weather satellite, your telecommunication satellite, or an indirect impact, um, who knows what's going to happen? What's it going to be like to have a community living on the moon? How is that going to change our society? How is it going to change our perceptions? It's going to completely change the perceptions of children growing up if there's 100 people living on the moon, right? Or if
Right.
there's 1,000 people living on the moon. That's gonna I can't even imagine. And so we need more voices. We need to get people to wake up and start having opinions about it.
And especially international voices. I mean, again, because people know a lot more about these things in the US, but I mean, I work on sort of like, that, okay, global South participation.
Yeah.
People should know about that because, again, even those countries that are not going to the moon, they will still be impacted by what is happening on the moon. And so those voices needs to be heard as well.
Absolutely, and I always do. My hashtag Space Needs Lawyers, and people sort of groan and Shakespeare. Let's kill all the lawyers. But we do, and we really need capacity. What it is, they call it capacity building,
Right.
right? And the UN does a good job on its limited budget trying to build capacity in space law, because it's really awareness raising. Um, you know, I was in Santiago, Chile, as part of one of these capacity building efforts last fall, and it's really understanding. Okay, no, you should be. They are actually pretty. Uh, they have a substantive voice in the UN because they're very concerned about dark and quiet skies.
Right.
Because there's so many telescopes in Chile. But South Africa, um, Botswana. I mean, everybody has a voice because it is the province of all humankind, and that's what we have to teach, and that's what we're trying to do: capacity building.
Yeah, no, I think those things are important. You also wrote a New York Times article recently in which you connected, sort of like, you talked about uh, technological revolutions, and you talked about sort of like, from tool making, agricultural revolution, you connected to industrial revolution, and then you said now space revolution. Um, but the flip side of those things is also, especially with the industrial revolution, you also have climate issues. You also have over resourced planet, our own planet, the earth, and stuff like that. How do you see this playing out in space? And so, again, I know that you are concerned about it, but there is a positive aspect to it, and you are mentioning sort of like, that it's going to impact everybody. But from the lessons from the past, how should we see, should we be seriously alarmed by it, or should we be thinking like, well, I mean, industrial revolution also led to many good things. How do you see those things in tandem?
So space is infinite. we on Earth we are bound. We're all on this pale blue dot together, right? And it's very small. If you look at that picture from Jupiter, right, or Saturn, I mean, it wow.
Yeah.
And so, in my view, we need to be stewards of our immediate space, our cislunar space, right? Perhaps even our solar system. Um, but I think we're going to find tremendous resources in the asteroid belt, for example. We know that these asteroids have rare earth metals. We can stop mining Earth, or we can start moving humans to other communities. We don't know, there are the what are the planets called that might be able to support human life, right? We found
Europa.
these.
You mean around Jupiter or
Yeah,
other
it's
places? Yeah,
Europa, and I
Europa.
mean there are places we can't. I'm a firm believer that we cannot be the only planet in the universe that can support
Okay.
human life.
Yeah.
It's going to take a long time to get there, right? But I think like we are. I it's very hard because people sort of think, oh, the next 50 years is it, right? Like, but it's not. When you think about humans overcoming their fear of fire and actually controlling it, it didn't happen in a overnight, right?
Yeah.
It took time, and the Industrial Revolution wasn't a decade, right?
Yeah.
We are in this at the beginning of this incredible period, and we're slowly going to get. And this is why it's so important. We need to use the moon to get beyond. The only parallel that we have in our history, that in our recorded history, is the Polynesians, right?
Right.
So they're on these islands south of Indonesia, and the island gets too small. And so what do? The one group decides, I'm just going to build a boat and go. You don't see other islands. You go to the South Seas and you can stand on an island, you don't see anything. You see the water hit the horizon and the stars. So these Polynesians literally um, shared where we are now, except we
Yeah.
know we're going up, right?
Right.
They didn't know where there's going to be another island. How many communities were lost trying to find another island? But they did find them, and they dotted those islands, and that's what I see. That's what I see humans doing. It's not going to be easy. It's going to take a long time, um, and but that is, we are on this cusp. We exploration is in our DNA, and
Yeah.
people say I have that. My Institute on Space Law and Ethics has a very diverse group of thinkers, right? And there's a group that says, we have to put the brakes on. We have to stop this. We're not ready for this. There's no brakes here.
Yeah.
We're going. And
Right.
we have to do our best to make sure that the people who are going, the companies that are going, act responsibly.
And you also have a personal connection. I think one of your parents is from China. I think
Yes.
Shanghai. So, and China right now is of course like a major space force, and probably uh, will go to China. Human missions to China from China. I mean, human missions to the moon from China is going to be likely within the next 5 to 10 years. How do you see that developing in the context of, is it going to be Cold War like space race, or is it going to be you see it as a different kind of a dynamic, maybe perhaps in a multipolar world? And I'm just curious. I mean, are you connected with the, or are you, do you visit regularly, or are you sort of like with the Chinese space program? How do you see that developing vis-a-vis sort of like international developments on the moon?
So I'm very pragmatic. My mother is probably one of the only human beings in history who fled China twice. In 1949, with the Guomindang, she went to Taiwan, and then 1989 after the Tiananmen massacre, she was working at the U.S. Embassy, and many of the personnel were told to leave. So the Chinese people, wonderful people. The Chinese Communist Party, not so much. Um, this is a race, very much, and it's ideological, just like the Cold War. The only difference here is that Americans have their head in the sand and like, it's not a race. I mean, how many people have I talked to at NASA and other governmental institutions? It's not a race. We've already been to the moon. We're fine. It is such a race because we have this treaty that is open to interpretation. whoever gets there first, whoever builds that installation first is going to say, hey, remember I said earlier in the conversation, we don't know what the regolith is like. You get there first and you can be all, oh my God, this is such a bad situation. You cannot come within 50 kilometers of me or you're going to ruin my material, my mission, my rovers. Um, and whoever controls the moon controls access to the rest of space. And the question that we have to ask ourselves is, which nation do we want building those norms and standards? To me, we live in a representative democracy. If it's the United States, I have a vote, I have a say. If it's China, I mean, you don't. And that's, forget the ideology of it. You're gonna have more voices if it's the United States than if it's China. Now, that said, any human achievement needs to be celebrated. I do think there is that the Chinese will get humans back to the moon before the Americans. I hope I'm wrong. Um, but if they do, oh my God, what an achievement that will be, right?
Right.
It'll be really
Right.
cool.
But in some sense, doesn't that lead back to the question, like, that it's the United Nations that should be representing humans in terms of setting the guidelines and rules? I mean, rather than the US or China or anybody, because I mean, those can also be complicated, right? I mean, with the US as well. I mean, it has its own historical problems.
But what people and when you say that it ought to be the United Nations. They ought to do something. The United Nations is an institution, and it's made up of states, and so
Right.
it's the states that do things, and that's why when I always say international community, yes, the international community should work through the United Nations to create these frameworks, and that's what we're trying to do. And the other question I always get is, well, enforcement. What are you going to do if China does
Right.
something bad, or what are you going to do if the United States does something bad? The United States doesn't always follow or support international claims against them, right? International law is imperfect. Russia invades Ukraine. That's a violation of international law. Oh well, but there's a framework there, and you create expectations, you create some morality, and that's what we need to do. Our Institute on Space Law and Ethics recognizes that we're probably not, anything that comes out of the from the international community through the UN, probably not going to be a binding treaty.
Right.
So what we need to do is find sort of the baseline things that we can agree on. And that's, for me, it's heritage. Everybody, every
Okay. Yeah.
country protects heritage. And then build from that. Why start creating a lunar governance framework when we're not going to agree on anything? Let's start with what we agree on and build bottom up. And that's what I'm so passionate about. Why I go to every single meeting of the United Nations, to tell the international community, wake up. We've got to start from the bottom up. And finally, Poland, Armenia, and the UK have all submitted proposals that show they understand that.
That's a really good point. Sort of like, that, okay, what everybody can agree on, and let's find a common ground and then move from there.
Yep.
One last question before we get, and I thought this is a pretty good place to end, but I could not let go, because you mentioned Star Trek, and I think you are a fan of Star Trek as well. So Star Trek, it has prime directive, but it also has a particular vision of space, and that particular vision of space is, I mean, in some sense, a utopian vision. It's a vision about, there is no money, for example, like, we are
Hmm.
post money and we are doing things for exploration, but then you also have a more pragmatic, in some sense, shows. I don't know if you've seen For All Mankind.
I
Have you
have
seen
not,
the show?
no, but
Oh, okay, all right. I was going to ask, sort of like, do you think any, when you think about the future in the next 50 years or 100 years, which is pretty reasonable in terms of thinking about space exploration, do you see more of us transporting the same kind of dynamics we have here on Earth, all of the politics and geopolitics and things like that, but now put it into space? Or do you see a foundationally different aspect, say for example, not exactly like Star Trek, but certainly with principles that are different than how humans have behaved here on Earth so far?
So, um, Star Trek is utopian, and remember, I think the backstory is that the Earth almost faced annihilation,
Right.
and they had that. So, I do think that sadly, we need an outside threat to bring us together. I don't, looking at the geopolitics and studying history, studying political science, you just it's human nature. There are good humans and there are bad humans. There are humans who want power. There are humans who are going to kill other humans because they can. Um, and we can't really sift out, only send the good humans to space. I
Right.
mean, that's not going to happen. This is my rose tinted glasses vision. Um, we have two competing lunar plans, right? The Artemis missions and the International Lunar Research Station.
Of China.
Everyone's going to the lunar South Pole where we think the water ice is. We will have two installations. They can't be that big, right?
Right.
Something will happen on Earth, and or something will happen on the moon, and the United States will say, "Oh, wow, we're going to need to go to China and ask for help." And this is like the Mars,
Right.
the Mars movie, right? Um, and the governments on Earth will say, "No, you can't. We're at war with them." And the people on the moon are going to say, yeah, no, we're doing this. And that's how
Right.
I truly see peace from space. We're going to need each other in space. And we're working to sort of create international standards so that we can help each other in space. What a great movement that is, right? Standardization, like so that we can share oxygen, whatever. So I think as we expand into space, we're going to see a breakdown in the sovereign system, that that we're going to see more individuals, we're going to see more commercial companies. The state itself is going to be less and less important. um, and I think we're going to see that degradation over the next 100 years. And I think that um, China is going to be a lot more stubborn about its sovereignty than some other nations.
Hmm.
The current Trump administration aside, there's it. I mean, I just think when you're in space, you're human. You're
Right.
not American or Chinese. And
Right.
and I think that is something that we're hopefully going to mature into.
Well, thank you very much for your time. I'm going to put links to For All Moonkind and some of your other articles that we mentioned in the description of this video. And this is a great, hopeful ending to the conversation. So, Professor Hanlon, thank you so much for your time.
Oh, thank you so much. This is fun. Went quickly.